Welcome to this exploration of alliances, neutrals, and enemies. Welcome to Geospinach. We are going to delve into how one's country's geopolitical position is interconnected with another's. We will traverse the spectrum of alliances from one end to the other. This is crucial to understanding the geopolitical position of your country in relation to others. If you truly think about it, you will realize that many countries' positions against you might be more negative or more positive than you think. Let's start with the classification of alliances. We have the concept of an ally, a neutral, and an enemy. A general summary of the systems that we're going to talk about are natural allies, biological allies, geopolitical and ideological allies, economic allies, neutrality, armed neutrality, military alliances, traditional enemies, ideological enemies, and economic competitors, as well as tease the topic of zones of influence. Beginning with allies, we have the stronger form of an alliance, which is natural allies. Natural allies are nations whose existence or prosperity is heavily dependent on another nation. For example, Canada's existence and prosperity is heavily dependent on the United States due to its geographic location and economic dependence. This makes the United States a natural ally for Canada. The same applies for Israel between the United States, Britain, and Cyprus. If a war were to occur in Israel, Israel will need to maintain supplies which will be guaranteed to come from the United States and will have to pass through Gibraltar, controlled by Britain, as well as Malta and Cyprus. This makes these three countries natural allies of Israel from Israel's perspective. However, from the United States perspective, as well as the other countries, Israel is not a natural ally. Some may call Israel a biological ally of the United States, since the United States played a vital role in the existence of Israel and its maintenance of its future. Next, we have biological allies. These are nations where, because of their culture and ethnicity, they have very close ties with each other. Their ethnicity and their culture has been intertwined in history, making the peoples of those nations look at each other very positively. For example, Greece and Cyprus, or the Greek Cypriots of Cyprus, are biological allies of the first degree. At the same time, Russia and Serbia can also be considered biological allies, but of a secondary degree. Europe in general and the Western world can also be considered biological allies of a third or fourth degree. The same applies for the whole of the Arab world. Then we move on to geopolitical allies and ideological allies, or allies of common interest. For example, France and Britain, which were historical, natural, and traditional enemies, became very strong military allies against Nazi Germany because of their commonality in ideology as well as geopolitics. Geopolitical alliance as well as ideological alliance imply that both nations have common political systems and, most importantly, mutual interest in many areas. The same again applies with Canada and the United States because of their proximity to each other and their common ideologies as well as common international interests. Lastly, in regards to alliances, we have economic allies. where economic interest of two nations will gravitate each other together into forming some sort of an alliance. For example, the European Union started purely as an economic alliance between nations where they had some degree of biological alliance as well as a smaller degree of natural alliance between them. But what made them really strong economic allies? Well, it's because of the small size of each European nation, making it much harder to compete with the outside world. Uniting together to forming a formalized economic alliance system will in theory benefit them more. What made the European unit to begin with was that natural economic attraction between the nations of Europe was the core to create the economic alliance. On this note, economic alliance or strong economic relations can be created and dissolved relatively fast in history. Then we have the concepts of neutrality, which can be simplified into the idea of having a permanent neutrality. This is the idea that the nation proclaims that whatever happens, they will remain neutral. For example, Switzerland, up until today, prior to the start of the Ukrainian war, where Switzerland, for the first time in history, stopped being neutral and publicly supported one nation over another. Of course, some may argue against this idea. And on that note, we have the concept of armed neutrality. The idea that a nation will be ready for war even if it does not take any side and always prepares for the inevitability of war. Example of this will be Finland, Sweden, and again Switzerland. In World War II, where neither of them joined any of the alliances, while Finland eventually did, but it was forced to. But at the start of the war, in 1939, it was an armed neutral country and it was prepared to fight. And when inevitably the Soviet Union attacked, it was ready to fight the Soviet Union. Due to the lack of military support by the West, Finland was forced in geopolitical terms to join Germany in its war with the Soviet Union. Now, before we go to the concepts of enemies, as you have observed, we skip the concept of military alliance. All of the above circumstances of alliance will lead in most cases to nations forming military alliances, which in essence are the strengthening of the aforementioned alliance systems. For example, the current debate in Europe whether Europe should form together into a common army, or for example the idea of the Arab League, where Egypt and Syria, as well as Jordan, because of their strong geopolitical, ideological, biological, and natural alliance, made them create a military alliance with a specific target, the destruction of Israel, or just NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Lastly, we have the concept of enemies. Here we can divide them into traditional enemies, which are enemies that are biologically and traditionally opposed to each other due to history or dramatic events. An unfortunate example of this will be Greece and Turkey, Cyprus and Turkey, Israel and the Arab world, the United States and Russia, and China and Japan. And we'll eventually make a video for each one of those conflicts to analyze why they were led to be natural and traditional enemies. Furthermore, we have ideological enemies. The greatest example of this will be the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. In simple terms, ideological enemies is enemies where their political ideas are so naturally opposed to each other that there inevitably leads to some sort of a conflict, either cold or hot. Although common ideology does not guarantee an alliance, as we have seen with the breaking of the Soviet-Sino relationship in the 1960s. Lastly, we have the weakest form of enemies, which are economic and geopolitical competitors. For example, two nations producing oil and not agreeing on oil prices, and then they start competing on those oil prices. Or, for example, Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, where they fought a war from 1879 to 1884 for some area of land that was rich in minerals. Cases where countries might not be traditional enemies, neither ideological enemies, but because of differences in geopolitical or economic interest, might lead them into a cold, hot, or a trade war. A great example of this will be the United States intervention into Iraq, where the United States, where geopolitical and economic interest into the region made them to go to war against Iraq. Of course, many will argue that war was also because of an ideology, which, if that is the case, then the United States will have already invaded China and probably half the world, which they partially did. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against the United States, I'm just pointing out the obvious. The same applies for the Soviet Union and China. Now, this is a very generalized form of alliance systems. But how do all of these alliance systems form? Well, the way and the means which they form is the concept of zones of influence. The very basic idea of zones of influence is the concept that, for example, in the Middle East, you had traditionally four powers: Iran, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and in some cases Iraq. They all competed for influence and leadership in the Middle East. This has led them against the odds to fight each other politically, economically, as well as militarily, despite the fact that they are traditional allies in many regards. So zones of influence adds another huge layer of complication when it comes to building alliance systems. This is a very generalized concept that stronger a nation is, the bigger the power it can exert on its neighbors. And the weaker a nation is, the less influence it has to prevent hard or soft pressure by stronger powers. But all of that on the next video. So please like and subscribe on GeoSpinach for more videos. Thank you for watching.